Hello, welcome to my channel. My name is Nicole and I like to do fashion DIYs. And in today's video, I am actually going to be showing you how I made this vest. This vest is actually a pattern I have been working on for a few months now, and it is finally ready to launch and I am so excited. This will be my third PDF sewing pattern that I have available on my Etsy page, which I will have linked down below if you are interested. I am so excited about this pattern because it is actually 100% reversible, so you can kind of make two things with the effort of one. Before I get into the tutorial, I just want to give a quick reminder to give this video a thumbs up if you liked it and followed along, and also to subscribe if you'd like to see more fashion DIY content. It's time to start. For supplies, you are going to need the basics, like some pins, fabric scissors, some sort of fabric marker. I'm using tailor's chalk, a hand needle, and we will need to make buttonholes, so you should have a buttonhole attachment for your sewing machine. You are going to need the sewing pattern, which is linked below, fusible interfacing. I didn't have a lot on hand, but luckily I had enough for this pattern. If you are making your vest reversible, you are going to need 8 3/4-inch buttons, but if you aren't making it reversible, you only need 4. And you will need 3/4 yard of either 2 contrasting fabrics or 1 shell fabric and 1 lining fabric. This is a woven fabric pattern, so you will need non-stretch material. For my fabrics, I've chosen this black corduroy and a mini houndstooth print. You will also need some matching thread. The PDF pattern is a total of 14 pages. Make sure your printer is set to A4 settings and 100% fit. I recommend printing the first page and measuring the 2-inch squared box to make sure that the settings are correct before printing the rest of the pattern. To assemble the pattern, you are going to need scissors or a paper cutter and some tape. When cutting the pattern, I only cut the right side and the bottom of the page. This makes it easier to line up when taping. Then I will tape all the rows together, starting with row A. When taping, it's important to line up all the triangles to make a square. Once the rows are taped, I am ready to attach the rows together. And once the full pattern is assembled, it's time to cut using your paper scissors. The pattern has a waist adjustment line. This is where you would either make the length of your pattern shorter or longer according to your own body measurements. To shorten it, you simply remove the amount needed evenly over the waistline. And to add length to the pattern, just cut the waistline and use scrap paper to add length, using tape to put it together. For this tutorial, I've shortened the pattern by 1 inch to better accommodate my short torso. Before cutting, make sure that your fabric has been pre-washed. This is a tight-fitting garment, and we would hate to have it shrink afterwards. Once that step is complete, it's time to cut out our fabric. And I'm starting with the corduroy. You will need to cut 2 of each pattern piece with both fabrics. So I'm folding my fabric in half so I can cut 2 at the same time. To make sure my pieces are straight, I'm measuring each pattern piece's grain line to the selvage of the fabric to see if it's even before pinning the pattern pieces in place. Then it's time to cut the pieces out. Don't forget to cut the notches before removing the pattern pieces. Then I repeated the same process on my houndstooth fabric. The last thing I need to cut is 2 pieces of fusible interfacing. Now that everything is cut out, I'm going to iron my interfacing to the center front pieces of one of my fabrics. Generally, you would choose the material that is more lightweight as the piece to iron the fusing to, but since mine are similar in weight, I am just going to press it to the corduroy. This next step is totally optional, but since I own a serger and hate fraying edges, even when you'll not be able to see them afterwards, I have to serge the edges. This just kind of makes the whole sewing process a lot more enjoyable to me. I don't know, maybe that's just me. Let me know in the comments if you are the same way. To construct this vest, we are going to start with assembling the front pieces. You will need the center front and the side front pattern pieces. With right sides together, start by matching the notches at the bust, pinning into place, then pin each end together before adding more pins. Since this is on a curve, you might want to add extra pins when sewing so it remains flat. Then we are going to sew at 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter seam allowance. That is what is used for this entire pattern. Then I sewed both front pieces together before moving on to the back. To sew the back, I am starting with sewing the 2 center back pieces together. Then sewing on the back side pieces, matching the notches up and pinning into place before sewing. Now it's time to attach the front and back pieces together, and we are going to do that only at the shoulder seams. Then go ahead and go back and press open all the seams you have sewn. If some areas are not laying as flat as you would like, you may have to clip the seam allowance. Proceed to do the same thing with your other fabric. Now it's time to attach both fabrics together. To do this, you are going to lay out both assembled pieces on top of each other. Make sure to lay out everything as flat and evenly as possible, matching up all the side seams and pinning everything into place. And now you are going to sew all the sides together but the side seams. So along the bottom back, the armhole, the front bottom, and all the way around the neckline, skipping over this side seam, and then sewing the other armhole closed. In total, there are 4 side seams that are not being sewn. Then it's time to take it to the machine and sew at the 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. So this is actually when I should have went around and clipped any of the curved edges, but I forgot to. So please don't forget to clip your seam allowances so it lays nice and flat after flipping it right side out. To flip it right side out, I am going to go from the back side and very patiently pull one of the front pieces through the shoulder strap. This part of the process does take some fiddling, so it's important to remember to take your time and to not get frustrated. And it's normal if you are pacing around as you try and push this large amount of fabric through a small channel. Once one side is flipped right side out, go back through that same side to turn the other front panel right side out. Now with the vest right side out, I am going to pin around the edges to help it lay as flat as possible. Then I went back with my iron and pressed my vest as flat as I could. I was also being mindful that you're not supposed to iron corduroy, so I only ironed the houndstooth side and I was heavy on the seam. To close up the side seams, I'm going to start with my vest laid flat out, and then I'm going to reach in between both fabrics on the back panel and grab the front piece side seam, pulling it all the way through so your front piece is now being sandwiched by the back piece. Then pin it so it's flat and sew. Once you pull to the right side again, the side seam will look like this. To close up the other side seam, you will only be able to sew part of it with the machine, and the rest you will have to stitch by hand. I thought for my fabric it would be easier to disguise the hand stitching on the corduroy side, so I made the other side the priority side when sewing with the machine. I sewed along the houndstooth side and at least an inch on either side of the corduroy fabric, leaving a hole a few inches long. Since the side seams can be a bit bulky when flipped right side out, I use a hammer to flatten out those seams, and it really helps reduce the bulk. Before hand stitching, I gave my fabric a little press/steam to make a bit of a guideline when stitching. Then I threaded my needle with black thread and did a slip stitch to close up the side seam. This next part is optional, but I decided to go ahead and do a top stitch all the way around the vest. This will help the fabric from rolling and exposing the other side when wearing it. Now it's time to set up the buttonholes. Alternatively to buttons, you could have used two-way snaps, but for this tutorial, I'm using buttons. Keep in mind, if you adjusted the waist, you will have to map out new buttonhole placements, since the ones in the pattern are for the regular waist length. To help me measure out new buttonholes, I drew a line with my tailor's chalk 1/2 inch from the center front and 1/2 inch from the neckline. Where those two lines meet will be where I place my first buttonhole, and the rest will be spaced evenly below. Mine ended up being 2 inches apart. I really recommend you test out your buttonhole maker on a scrap piece of fabric that is the same as your project. I can't tell you how many times a buttonhole has failed me in my past projects. So once I'm happy with the way it looks, it was time to sew the buttonholes onto the vest. After successfully sewing all 4 buttonholes, I opened them up by pinning either side of the hole and used my seam ripper to cut it open. The pins prevent me from accidentally cutting too far and cutting the thread. Once they are all open, I use my chalk to mark where my buttons should be on the other side. Now it's time to sew the buttons. And I won't lie, this whole double button thing was a little challenging, but I did figure it out after several failed attempts. So make sure you watch this whole part through before attempting. I'm going to start by anchoring my first button to one side. Then I'll move my needle to the other side, and then I'll thread my second button. But before I go back to secure it, I'm going to place a spacer in between the button and the fabric. This spacer is very important because it is going to allow you to have enough room to actually button up your vest, and you will also need that additional space to tie off and complete your button. I used a bobby pin as my spacer, but a toothpick would also work. Then I stitched back and forth between the 2 buttons. Once it was secure enough, I pushed my needle to the back of the opposite button and wrapped the thread around the button a few times before tying it off. I repeated this process for the rest of the buttons. Here is how it turned out. This is how the corduroy side looks. I think the fit is perfect, and I'm happy with the waist modification that I made. I also realized while buttoning up the other side, you can use the buttons on the inside to do up the buttons, which means even though it's reversible, the side you overlap when you do it up is the same on both sides. But this is how the houndstooth side looks, and I think this side is my favorite. I am so excited to wear this vest. I feel like I'm going to get so much wear out of it. So that is it for today's video. Once again, I will have the link to the PDF pattern down below in my description, and if you would like to follow along for my future projects and to see what else I get up to, please be sure to subscribe, and I will catch you in the next one.